Good afternoon, everyone, or evening or morning, wherever you happen to be joining us from. My name is Rob Reich. I am the faculty co-director of the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. And it's my great privilege and honor to be the host today of a webinar discussion about philanthropy and power with the authors of two brand new books that dive into what I view is an essential feature of a blossoming conversation these days amongst philanthropists and indeed amongst people who are concerned about democracy. And that essential feature is how to put in the center of our considerations about the role that philanthropy plays in society, the question of power. And when we focus on questions of power, rather than on conventional questions in the past decade plus about effectiveness or strategy or delivering outcomes and having impact, and look instead at the relational dimensions of philanthropy and the power that philanthropists have wielded presently and historically, we open up a vista of considerations that allow us to think about dynamics of race, about dynamics of capitalism, about dynamics of gender, about dynamics of empire and imperialism that are woven into the history of certainly American philanthropy. And the authors who will join us today to have a discussion about philanthropy and power will talk about the manner in which their own work illuminates a set of questions that really foreground concerns about power and philanthropy. So I play the role of host. I'm going to introduce very briefly our two authors and participants in this webinar, and then our moderator for the conversation, and turn the floor over immediately to them. So first, it's a great privilege for me to introduce a friend, a colleague, Lucy Bernholz. She's the director of the Digital Civil Society Lab at the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society at PACS. Her new book is called How We Give Now, a Philanthropic Guide for the Rest of Us. She's a self-described policy and philanthropic wonk. She's been thinking and writing about philanthropy for more than 20 years. I think it's fair to describe her as a visionary, someone who always has her pulse on what's coming next in philanthropy. She and I have collaborated on writing about the history of philanthropy and the relationship between philanthropy and democracy before, and it's a real treat to have a chance to engage her new book today, How We Give Now, a Philanthropic Guide for the Rest of Us. We'll also be joined by Maribel Morey. She is the founding executive director of the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences. That's an institute which centers the work of the global majority of scholars in the social sciences and neighboring fields in order to allow us to imagine a world in which we engage the vast majority of humanity rather than putting in the foreground people from a global minority, which is to say people from the United States or perhaps other small countries that have played an outsized role in the globe over the past century plus. Her extraordinary new book has an arresting title called White Philanthropy, Carnegie Corporations, An American Dilemma and the Making of a White World Order, just published by the University of North Carolina Press. Maribel is also the co-founder and the co-editor of the History of Philanthropy blog. You can find that online at histphil.org, and an extraordinary resource for scholars and practitioners to learn more about the history of philanthropy. And I'll also mention that Maribel has been an affiliate and spent some time in residence here at Stanford PACS some number of years ago. It's a treat to have Maribel join us today. And finally, our moderator for today is Professor Khalil Anthony Johnson, Jr. He's an assistant professor of African American Studies at Wesleyan University. He's working on a book manuscript with the title Schooled, An Unsettling History of American Education that considers how non-governmental and charitable institutions, from missionary associations to industrial philanthropy, found common cause with imperial powers to remake and colonize the world through schooling. So you can see how the work of these three scholars really puts power at the center of the analysis that they bring to bear on questions about philanthropy, civil society. And I want to turn the floor over now to Khalil to lead our conversation with Lucy and Maribel. You're still on mute, Khalil.
Thanks, Rob. You would think after all this year and a half that I would be used to this, but I did want to just say thank you everyone for taking the time to join this conversation. As Lucy's work is informing us, like, time is a valuable commodity, and we appreciate the donation that you've made for the next hour and a half. I just want to say how excited I am to have been invited to participate in this conversation. My work is about schooling, but in the course of understanding the history of education in the Americas, I necessarily have had to delve into the history of benevolence and philanthropic giving. And we have two quite different books to discuss today. Maribel's book as a history of the Carnegie Corporation's notable project, titularly held by Gunnar Myrdal, An American Dilemma, really puts that book in dialogue with previous Carnegie Corporation funded projects that were fundamentally about white domination in British colonial Africa, and that drew parallels between the African American experience and the British colonial African experience to provide justification for white domination across the Atlantic. And in that history, if you're familiar with the field, it's going to stand alongside books like Kenneth J. King's Pan-Africanism and African-American Education, or African Education, and James D. Anderson's The Education of Black People in the South, which is to say it for the next several generations will be a keystone in understanding this connection. Lucy's work, meanwhile, takes a more contemporary perspective. And what I find is that Lucy is changed from the historian's hat to the ethnographer, doing an investigation that prompts us to consider the very nature of philanthropy and what counts as philanthropic giving, which is animated by the question of how we give in the title. And my own sense of these texts is that many readers will find personal connections to Lucy's work, because as an ethnographic or anthropological project almost, it does challenge the normalization of philanthropic giving. And, you know, it made me question that dollar donation at CVS for a good cause. But on a more personal level, it made me reflect on my family's history. Lucy talks about a community in Boynton, Alabama, of quilters who for generations have made quilts, 4 per bed in a community of several hundred people. This work is done by women, and describes how a philanthropic endeavor seeks to provide some form of non-governmental reparation for that community by turning those quilts into a commodity that has value that can be reinvested in the community so people don't have to leave. That community, Boykin, is on a bend of the Alabama River called Gee's Bend, which is across the river from Camden, Alabama, which is where my own ancestors on my mother's side of the family were enslaved. And when I went there a few years ago, just to put my hand in the Alabama River, to be close to those ancestors who were captive, you know, I had stopped at a place that happened to be a gift shop advertising these Gee's Bend quilts. Meanwhile, Lucy is also asking us to consider philanthropy as something beyond money, but also includes the donations of time and data, and talks specifically about the donation of medical data for philanthropic research. And I had never thought about this before, but Lucy, your work made me think about how my own father decided in the 90s to participate in an AIDS vaccine study. This was before the mRNA study. It was, I think, an adenoid vaccine. And I called him over the weekend to be like, why did you decide to give up this information for this project? And he said that he, you know, as a heterosexual Black man, that he knew that he would probably be one of only a few in that demographic to participate. And he also said that, he had known so many people at that point who had died from AIDS. And I asked him if he considered it philanthropy. He said, no. I considered it a debt of gratitude. But I think that sense of gratitude and love of humanity is precisely what you're reframing in terms of philanthropy. And I wonder if after reading your book, he would change his perspective. And so with that said, I would just say that, we have maybe 3 broad talking points for this evening. What is philanthropic giving? How does philanthropic giving work? And why is philanthropic giving necessary? So I'll just go ahead and turn to one of the prompts. Book projects, I'm working on one. It's been over a decade of work, valuable time, energy, resources, money that's not even mine. So I'd love to start by asking each of you to explain your motivations behind this project and the sort of intellectual trajectory that led you to do the work that you're doing now.
Lucy, please start. Go ahead.
Sorry, I couldn't find the mute button. Well, first of all, thank you to Rob and Khalil and Maribel and to all of the people behind the scenes at PACS who are making this possible. I've been waiting to be in conversation with Maribel since I heard about her project, which was several years ago. And I've only recently met Khalil, but I feel like we've got lots and lots to talk about from your work, and I hope you'll join in the conversation. So what prompted the book? A lot of things, and even some of the things that Khalil touched on, my own questions about what are these things, what are people doing when they're donating to medical research, might have been one of the earliest questions. But really, I have been working in and around foundation philanthropy for decades now. I wrote my dissertation on private philanthropy and public schooling. And at the time, the word philanthropy, I'm sitting here thinking I should go back and look at the dissertation. I think you could use it as a synonym for foundations. And it didn't occur to me in the early 90s when I was starting this work that was at all unusual or problematic, but it has certainly been growing on me ever since. So I think the project was motivated by a couple of things. First of all, there's a lot of books being written about philanthropy now, more and more really good ones like Maribel's, and I'm sure Khalil's will be, and I'm thinking of work by Megan Ming Francis and Eric Colarinas and others, but most of the books that get a lot of attention in the foundation philanthropic world, at least, are written for really wealthy people. They're written about them and for them. Which the for them part is always a little surprising to me because really wealthy people actually have a lot of people to read for them, so and do their work. So that was one thing. But the other kind of book there's a lot of were these examinations of individual people who've turned their lives inside out and dedicated themselves 120% to making something amazing happen. And that's interesting, and those people are incredible, and here and even communities who do this. I'm thinking of Rebecca Solnit's work on A Paradise Built in Hell, things like this. And I just thought none of this has anything to do with what I see going on all around me, all the time, whether I'm at home here in the unceded land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, otherwise known as San Francisco, or traveling around the world. I see people doing all kinds of other things, and it appears to be some form of giving, but it's not a big foundation or a wealthy family or anything like that. So I just was very curious as to what the people who were doing these other kinds of things thought they were doing. And I don't mean that like, what do you think you're doing? I meant it seriously, like, when you're doing this, what do you think of it as? What is it an expression of? Why are you doing it this way? How are you doing it? And that was really the motivation for the book. And when I started with the how part, I run something with Rob called the Digital Civil Society Lab. There's been nothing but hype over the last decade or so about how digital technologies are changing everything, including giving. Almost a decade ago, I started asking people this question: how do you give? And the distinction between a crowd-funded donation or a check written or a time donated, the technology was really background for almost everybody. And that was true, a little less true 10 years ago, totally true in the work we did in 2019, the research I did about this. It's the how is about many other things, but very little of it has to do with the functional system that undergirds an actual contribution of something. So that's what was really I was getting at. I can pass the same question on to Maribel, though. You spent a long time on white philanthropy. Tell us what got you into this project.
Thanks, Lucy, and thanks, Khalil. Actually, I wanted to start with thank yous. First to Lucy for the invitation to be on this platform and to talk about our two books. And to Rob, I wanted to thank you too for making Stanford PACS a cozy space when I would visit. So I appreciate that so much, and for welcoming me into your growing orbits of scholars. I very much respect the mission at Stanford PACS of having people situated in their disciplines and then coming together in an interdisciplinary conversation. At Stanford PACS, I also want to thank SSIR because Eric Nee, who's editor-in-chief, and also Jennifer Morgan, they've published several pieces of mine since 2014, and I've enjoyed that platform. And Khalil, I just want to thank you for your thoughtful reading of our books. We all have day jobs, and it takes that much more effort to engage with, as Lucy was mentioning, all the literature out there. So thank you so much for your time. So as far as the motivation, I have to go back to a version of myself that was 20 and living in Paris during college. And I was trying to make sense of myself as a Latina. And the race-sex analogy started fascinating me. So I was reading Simone de Beauvoir, and she, by chance, started relying on this man's book called An American Dilemma, and Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, to make that analogy. And I thought, why would she need to lean on a man to think through this? And then second, why is this white Swedish economist writing this book on racial equality? And over time, it got me thinking about my own role in the academy, in the sense of, well, no matter what I write, will it be more prominent if a white Anglo-American or someone who's proximate to that identity writes it? And will they be cited more? I saw this when I was in law school, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg had been inspired by Simone de Beauvoir, but knew the sociology of knowledge in her milieu to quote Myrdal more often when she was trying to extend the race-sex analogy in the 14th Amendment. So it's very personal. It's making sense of that. And then over time too, realizing that this book was very much enamored much more by white Anglo-Americans than really Black scholars. And for me, that was fascinating too, because for a long time since I was applying for college, trying to make sense of this world of white liberalism and how it provided a definition of equality for me as a Latina and what was expected of me. And so considering this a Bible of white liberalism, I started penetrating its intellectual origins. So first was Myrdal's intellectual origins in the book, and trying to understand where his ideas of assimilation came from, his equation between assimilation and equality, and a sense of like equating morality with white Americans, even though they were perpetrators of anti-Black discrimination and violence. So, and then in the process of doing this research, I realized it was funded by Carnegie Corporation of New York. And growing up in Miami, in Cold War Miami, there was only communism and profit maximizing capitalism. So who were these people who were apparently in a capitalist society, but were supposed to not be about profit maximizing, and yet they wanted to solve social problems, but not to the point of becoming revolutionary guerrilleros. You know, they're not exactly Che Guevara. So what was the purpose of this? What was philanthropy? And how far, what was that gray area that they like to exist in, of addressing social problems, but not disrupting a capitalist society? So at the heart of it, it's very much this book. Lucy, you were talking about the audience for your book. This book is for a lot of us, BIPOC kids who have grown up and still kids who are trying to make sense, navigating a dominant definition of equality in the US. And for many of us, it doesn't feel complete. And this book penetrates the institutional and intellectual history of this dominant definition of racial equality that affects so many of us that we confront, and explains its limitations and its deep roots in white supremacy.
Thank you both for those really, to me personally, moving answers. And I say moving in part because one of the lessons from Black feminism is to pull back the scrim or the illusion of objectivity, which oftentimes both of your projects, I think, suggest philanthropy hides behind. And so the importance of a research project that develops expertise fundamentally guided by personal lived experience seems to be an important entryway into understanding philanthropy in our own day and era, and historically as well. So I had a question about our personal relationships to philanthropy. I note that, Lucy, you got some money from the Rockefeller Foundation to go to Bellagio, Italy to write this book project. Maribel, you received some money from the Carnegie Corporation to write your project. I would not be here without the Ford Foundation or the Spencer Foundation or a nonprofit corporation called Teach for America, which helped prompt my intellectual journey. But I'm going to skip that question because we're running low on time. And instead, I will just ask you both, what is philanthropy? Maybe we'll start with Maribel. How do you see the role of the Carnegie Corporation in defining institutional or corporate philanthropy? And then I'd like to ask Lucy, your work takes a more contemporary approach, but how do you intervene in traditional definitions of philanthropy? And could you say more about what your book project calls the giving scape? So I'll go ahead and turn it back to you.
Thanks, Khalil. This word philanthropy, for anyone who studies philanthropy, probably after a while you say it so often that it becomes problematic. And I've definitely been questioning my use of the word philanthropy and philanthropic organization, because it's very dangerous. It's a very powerful equation between philanthropy, wealth, and whiteness in the global north, right? So why should we be calling these organizations philanthropic? What exactly, if we, again, to your central question, or your central point before, which was like, if philanthropy is a love of mankind, then we should really question whether these organizations are acting out a love of mankind, and whether we should shift that use of the word to other groups of people and other types of behavior. So being much more conscientious about the use of that word, and maybe we just call them redistributive organizations, like wealth redistributive organizations, to say what they're doing and to show that it doesn't necessarily carry a morality with it in the process. Now, as far as Carnegie Corporation of New York, there's a version of it in my book, which is from its founding in the 1910s and 1911 to the 1940s. And then there's Carnegie Corporation today. I would say overall, it has a long history of supporting scholars. So that creates a bit of a market distinction in some way, having these scholarly programs. As far as corporate philanthropy, something to give in mind too, is not just market distinction amongst other institutional foundations like that, whether it's Hewlett or Ford or others, but also questioning like what relationship do we have with our founders' history. So I would find that Carnegie Corporation can be a little bit, protective of Andrew Carnegie's image. And question to have is why? Why should we be protective? What is it about corporate philanthropy, or as you use that term, or institutional philanthropy, that makes some organizations, or a large part of them, really defensive about that history? Arguably, they don't need to be. And yes, I'll turn it over to Lucy. We can talk about it, but I always see it as a pretty mainstream form of institutional philanthropy. But you can push back on that or ask me more questions on that.
Maribel, I'm sorry I keep calling you Maribel. It's just my brain.
And you could just say Maribel if you want to go.
I did want to ask. So in your book, you talk about this sort of conflict between people who challenge the philanthropic organizations, often Black people, including Carter G. Woodson.
Yeah.
So have you, in your own research or lived experience, encountered pushback when you challenge the image of the founder or the philanthropic organization?
Well, Khalil, thanks for that question. Yes, so I was an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, which meant that I had 2 years of research sabbatical funded by Carnegie Corporation. I have extended my interest in sharing research on this book. I think they're being a little bit cautious about their interest in engaging on this book. But I'm very open to it and would like it.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask.
So yes.
Thank you. Lucy, go ahead.
That's such a deep and rich vein of discussion. I want to just listen to it. You asked, and yes, not only have I been funded by foundations and in my current position as well, but I've worked for them and I've consulted to them, and I've really been in the world of foundation philanthropy professionally for most of the last 30 years since writing a dissertation about them. So, which is to say, in a very meta way, it's very funny. I have written this book about what I think of as sort of many things but foundation philanthropy, yet to kind of prove the point of the book that philanthropy in the US in 2021 is almost synonymous with foundations. Everybody wants to talk about foundations when I want to talk about this book. Now that may have to do with who I've been talking to, but I've come to think of foundations. I do think, I agree, Maribel used the word dangerous. As I've been thinking about this since the book came out, I actually think, I wrote this book partly to expand our imagination and our engagement with all of these other things, that when I ask people, how do you give? Which to me is still, it's not etymologically within loving mankind, but it's I'm making that leap. I got a whole bunch of other things that I wanted to understand. And I think one of the things that alone is important, I do think it is actually dangerous to conflate this idea of giving with this very structured, legally sanctioned, wealth management related, power-centric thing called a foundation. It's dangerous, and I can go on that at length. But I also think it's wrong, and it's offensive, actually. So I was trying to show this bigger picture. But the thing that was really under my skin that led me to really thinking about commodification and the giving-scape term were the degree to which the people I spoke with about giving, most of the people who appear in the book are people of color. Most of them are women. Most of them are not from the coasts. Most of them are Black. Many of them are Black. I'm not sure it's actually most. But there's indigenous men, there are people with disabilities, there's a lot of queer people, there are a lot of people with varying levels of longevity on this land, and formally sanctioned recognition of that, of their time in this land. And what they were describing and what the philanthropic industry, the foundation world and nonprofit world talk about were, there's intersections, but they're very disparate. And the philanthropic nonprofit side of that equation has spent at least the last decade, if not longer, talking about the democratization of this space. And talk about a word that just sort of fades to the background now. We hear it about everything, the democratization of investing, the democratization of milk products, the democratization of philanthropy. And I kept asking myself, I happen to have the pleasure of working with a political theorist, Rob, what's democratizing about this? Isn't democracy somewhere in there about power? Isn't there something in there about, and the more I peeled at that, the more I picked at it and really thought about it and looked at all these different things that have gotten all this attention, crowdfunding, LLCs, text message giving, you name it, put a digital underpinning to it and call it new and sexy. It's like, these are just intermediated products. Where's the democracy? There's no shift in power. There's a shift in transactional functionality. And it all started to look like shoes to me, like picking between shoes. They're products. And that was true, ironically, or surprised, I shouldn't say ironically, but I was a little bit surprised at the extent to which that reality, the commodification of giving, that it's not enough to just, giving money to someone sitting outside a drugstore is still somewhat, shunned. But in the last 2 or 3 years, Give Directly, which is a digitally enabled cell phone based way to give money directly to poor people on the other side of the planet, was lauded and valorized. I don't get it. It doesn't make sense to me. And that's when it all started to click, that there are a whole bunch of products. Some more and more people at the wealthy end of the wealthiest ends of the spectrum are not turning to foundations. They're turning to these other things, LLCs and DAOs. And people, the rest of us, the kind of folks I tried to talk to for the book, who I should explain because this title has been attached to it and I didn't put it there. The people I talked to, for the most part, that scholars on this call, you can tell me where they fit, were people in this country who, for the most part, have a single job that pays into their family budget, if they may have a partner who's also providing a single source of income, decreasing part of the population, and they have access to health insurance. I don't know what class strand you want to put those folks in, because none of that makes sense to me, but that's who's mostly described here. And what they were doing was choosing between products. Or they were being, more often I should say, they were actually being offered the opportunity to choose a product. And that's what I was interested in with the Givingscape.
Lucy, thank you for that answer. You've covered in that short response a number of the questions I have already. We have about 20 minutes left before we open it up to questions. But I would just like to add as a comment, in terms of your response, one of the things that was in the back of my mind as I was reading both of your books was David Graeber, the late anthropologist's work, who, notably he had a famous book on debt. He contributed to Occupy Wall Street. He just has a posthumous book being published on the history of humanity. And to me, Graeber's, as an anthropologist, in thinking about debt, it seemed like, Lucy, you're also trying to say that we should think more about humanity outside of a practice of market relations that have become commodified, and that there's a long tradition of human almsgiving. And so that makes a distinction between giving $1 to a person on the street who might practice a small form of, as Graeber calls it, a lowercase c communism. That there are ways that we give to each other all the time that are not based on investment or reciprocity, but are freely given out of concern or care, which would include the exchange of needles or heroin for a person who's going with withdrawals, other things that fall within our moral landscape that we would like to criminalize, but that we might think differently about if we have a more capacious definition of giving that you've provided us. On the flip side of that, we do exist in this world of market relations and commodification, and Maribel's work is centered on a turning point, I think, in human history of a vast wealth that had never been accumulated on that scale before. What I would like to ask Maribel now is to turn to the question, how does philanthropic giving work? So you note, and pardon me, I was reminded of Kanye West, who famously has asked, how can one man have all that power? And in your work on Frederick Keppel, who's the head of the Carnegie Corporation, who manages to maneuver a board of trustees and the legacy of Andrew Carnegie to fundamentally steer a philanthropic giving project to shape public policy across two empires, the British Empire and the American. So what I want to ask you is how does philanthropy work in that vein? And to what extent is corporate philanthropy working to launder the ideas of a very small minority in order to lay the groundwork for broader shifts in public policy that seem organic?
Tiny question, Khalil. Okay. So one, I do want to emphasize that my historical process for the book. So scholars before and writing before White Philanthropy really didn't put much value or think that Keppel, Frederick Keppel, who was president of Carnegie Corporation in the 1920s and 30s into early 40s, had much of a theory, a philosophy, that he just sort of made funding decisions on the whim. When I went into the archives, I had the value of going to a PhD program right in New Jersey, and I spent years just going back and forth between the archives at Columbia. So I could just get really, really bored, and I read through cataloged material, like just Keppel's papers, like 60 boxes, and reading through birthday cards to his sons, and just getting really into that board archival process, which is also very exciting. So my process is first going into the Board of Trustee minutes. First is the annual reports, and that from the 1910s to the 40s, annual reports, Board of Trustee minutes, then going into the network of individuals there on the board and staff, and then from there stretching out to advisors and their archives and the grantees, with Myrdal in this story being a prominent grantee. So I look at the relationships. Other people consider it like network studies. And so it's not that he had complete power, like someone who just takes over an organization. The book also explains that he inherited an organization with its own history of privileging white Anglo-Americans in the British Empire. So understanding him within an institutional context, and then also that as much as he had a vision for cooperative social scientific research, and within that history and that institutional history, privileging white Anglo-Americans and their needs, and thus providing these studies to white Anglo-American leaders and policymakers, that changed over time depending on his particular network of advisors. So the structure of the Poor White Study in South Africa, both in research structure and public policy intent, was slightly different, even though it's all about a white world order, because they assumed that international peace and order required white Anglo-American leadership, that it was slightly tweaked depending on the particular ecosystem of funders, of grantees, I mean. So hopefully in White Philanthropy, the reader sees how, yes, Keppel was a leader, but in a dialogue. It was a constant dialectic with advisors and grantees. And that also spills over into my explanation of his relationship with Myrdal. There's a constant dialectic between them. Their offices are walking distance from each other. Myrdal is providing reports consistently, and Keppel's providing feedback. So understanding a dance, that relationship between funder and grantee. So I piece it together through a decades-long deep dive into the archives. And as far as now, your question was on, if you can repeat it on the, like, just how, can you repeat the second part of the question?
I was just kind of interested in how the work of philanthropy acts to launder a specific set of ideas or policy goals through an objective framework of a neutral, nonpartisan report, for instance.
So I look at that question as far as, again, the dialectic and the dialogue between funders and grantees, and specifically scholars. I had a major self-analysis as an Andrew Carnegie Fellow. So I'm not Black, and I got funding for 2 years to do research on the Black American experience in the US and philanthropy. And I thought, I'm writing this critical history of Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, and here I am funded by the same organization to do similar research. Like, what role am I playing in the academy? I think these are questions for all of us to be asking, both funders and potential grantees. What role is our knowledge production playing? What role is funding affecting the knowledge that we're producing? Who do we keep as our prominent audience for our research? And just for our power is at the heart of this, talking about, like the topic of our conversation. In the academy, we are trained to look out for our own careers, to publish in publications that are behind paywalls in a capitalist society, to seek more and more prestige in dialogue with and in collaboration with elite funders. So really asking ourselves, both as funders and grantees, what is knowledge for? Who's being included? Who's not? Why? Is that a form of domination? And so these are questions that, and having this internal dialogue, and along with other colleagues, that was a genesis of the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences, where we really bring together, our aim is to bring together scholars across the world, the global majority, to learn about each other's work, to amplify each other's work, because it's still a space of domination, knowledge production, and also questioning, relatedly, our funding model. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for that response. And I guess I'll move to the question, third prompt, which is, why is giving necessary? And in that sense, based on the conversation, I presume that one answer is that because we live in a society with vast inequality. So we'll start from there. And what I want to do is ask two questions. One is to Lucy, which is, in what ways does the question of how we give help disrupt a certain narrative that centralizes a white mainstream notion of philanthropy? And then to Maribel, I just want to ask, some of what Lucy's work does is presume a kind of goodwill and egalitarian ethos that animates American politics. And in your book, you note how Myrdal used that sense in order to promote a narrative that would enable Black subservience to white domination. And so I guess to you, Maribel, how does American Dilemma similarly promote this American creed and white egalitarianism to different ends? And what is that? What's the lesson from there for our current era in which Lucy is commenting too? We have about 10 minutes to open up to questions.
The wise moderator realizes we have long answers. So thanks for the question. There is an enormous amount, uncounted, unquantifiable, unquantified, I suppose it would be quantifiable, but it hasn't been, of giving that happens between people and extended kin and community, that is absolutely fits into this definition, to the true definition of philanthropy. There's an enormous amount that is literally life-saving. It's the economy that it is keeping certain communities going. And some of the most exciting and truly challenging to the norm of this I've learned about from people like Carolyn Shanaz Hossein and other people deeply involved in solidarity networks and collectives and mutual aid, where there's not just, I'm thinking also of Nip Tilson in South Dakota and the Indian collective. I'm sorry, I think I'm forgetting the second word of the name. This is about survival. This is giving as there's a kind of reciprocity, but it's deeper than that. It is a recognition that I live because you live. I thrive because you do. And some of it is very explicitly engaged in out of a desire to, well, first of all, a need to survive, a need to fight for one's own humanity. You know, you see this among, you know, Black trans women literally trying to stay alive and keeping each other alive. And some of it is motivated by a very deliberate attempt to sort of prefigure a totally different way of existing that's past capitalism or anti-capitalist. And some of it is encultured and capitalist at the same time. But it's all happening all around us. And I find it to be, at least in the 450 people I got to talk to about this, very, very meaningful to them. No matter where it falls on the spectrum, or that's not a spectrum, but, you know, a set of things I just described. And I hope very much that the stories in the book and the people in the book and the extraordinary care and thoughtfulness and commitment that they bring to what they do actually unlocks everyone else's, especially people who are in the philanthropic industry per se, imagination about what is possible. Because I think that, again, back to the beginning, the equation of philanthropy is rich white money is dangerous. It's dangerous, wrong, and offensive. And I'll leave it at that without going into that in more detail. But I also just, I mean, it's not what's going on around us. It's not what's making it's actually not what's keeping people alive. It's not what's pursuing justice. It's not what's keeping people alive. And it's not what's going to help us through these collective crises that just keep escalating all around us. So that's why it's important. And if it expands people's imagination, then I've done what I set out to do, because I really think we have lost a lot of imagination about what philanthropy is. So I'll give Maribel a chance.
No, and to connect it, Lucy, so losing imagination on what philanthropy is, and also what equality is. So that'll be my segue. So in the book, I explain how An American Dilemma was modeled on an African survey, which was a prior study financed by Carnegie Corporation through Chatham House. It was modeled in public policy intent and also in research structure. So unlike the prior study in cooperative social sciences in South Africa, financed by Carnegie Corporation, this one would be headed by one person, one white male European with policy experience and an invisible team of researchers, and he alone would be responsible for the final research project. And the policy intent of it was to help white policymakers across empires in Africa better communicate their policies with each other as a means of maintaining white domination on the continent. And when Keppel is reconsidering funding practices in the US, this model, research model, comes to mind specifically because, one, he picks someone with a white European male with policy experience. I can explain why he picked someone who's a tangent to white Anglo-Americans, a Swede, and not a white Anglo-American, but still within a white European context. And the intent was to help policymakers across geographies, in this case, across the US, across states, better communicate their policies on Black Americans as a way of solidifying white Anglo-American domination. Because for them, the set of individuals and advisors, international order rested on white Anglo-American domination. They were, and I can go more into detail on that in the Q&A. So, but they were thinking that they were advocates of racial equality because they too were funding Black education, though a form of education that would produce equality in a very, very, very long period. And in the meantime, the priority was maintaining international order of white Anglo-American domination. So conversations on morality, of which an African survey and an American dilemma were both part of, can be modes of power for those in charge. So in an African survey, ultimately Haley, who's the director, says, readers, please, policymakers, specifically too in England, saying you need to justify your presence, the British presence in Africa. It's no longer okay to just dominate because Germany wants its colonies back. And so you need to explain your value added on the continent. And so that's where this conversation on development, for example, gets expressed, and saying and he was arguing you have to explain how you're adding to development of the continent and of the African people. You have a moral responsibility. And in a similar way, there's a morality to the argument in American Dilemma, ultimately mirrored, although imagines that will help the US become that much more of the most powerful white nation in the world. And he explicitly says that if you basically follow my prescription, the US will come out of this as the most powerful, quote unquote, white nation. So I think for today, as we think about equality and equity in philanthropy, it's to really give conscientious thought to what are we talking about? You know, it seems really prominent right now to say, you know, one is an advocate of racial equality. Nobody wants to say they're an advocate of racial inequality, you know, at least the mainstream organizations. But what exactly is equality? And to what extent is the definition of equality still rooted in white supremacy, if it's one that is rooted in American Dilemma, which is a prominent one? What are the priorities? So one can say easily that one is an advocate of racial equality, like these actors that I've traced in the first half of the 20th century. And yet for them, the priority at the end of the day was an international order dominated by white Anglo-Americans, even as they funded Black schools. So I would, I would say it's a dominant question we should be asking in foundations and even in our own research as scholars is, are we really all on the same page on what racial equality looks like, both nationally and globally?
I think the contemporary moment might say that we are not. But the question needs to be asked. Speaking of questions asked, we have about 20 minutes for questions. If you would like to ask a question, please post in the chat. We have currently a few questions on deck, so I'll go ahead and ask one. This is directed to Lucy. It says, you mentioned that many interviewed were women of color, people of different abilities, indigenous men, etc., as an overview of the observed differences. Other than noting that most were employed and having access to healthcare, did you uncover any commonalities?
Great question. Well, here's one that actually has me, that I've been thinking about since doing all these conversations and workshops and finishing the book, is that is the word voluntary, which is often used in describing philanthropy. And in fact, I myself have introduced myself for years saying, you know, philanthropy and engagement in civil society, it's a voluntary act, unless you have my mother, because it wasn't voluntary in my family. It was something we did. And I no longer introduce myself that way, because what I picked up from all of these conversations and workshops was the degree to which for so many of these people, I don't have a percentage, I wasn't tracking something like that, but that there really isn't a sense of choice in the participation itself, that this is an obligation, it's a duty, it's a responsibility, it's a whole bunch of things. And that has lots of different sources, whether we're talking kinship care or mutual aid or an actual donation to somebody outside, handing $1 to someone sitting on the sidewalk. But the voluntary word has really started to be confusing to me. And that's because of the people I spoke to saw this as obligatory. I should say, in prefacing that, the we talked to 400 plus people, but that's not a lot of people when you think about all the people in the US. We tried very hard to not just talk to people who we knew had direct connections to giving. We went to community centers and libraries and pubs and church basements and things like that. So we were trying to get beyond that, but the scholar in me will say that there's a sampling problem here. But I'll put that on the table because it's the thing that I still think about the most, having finished the book, a year ago.
Thank you. This question is directed at both of you, and I'll just sort of provide a synopsis of what they're asking, which is, given that the importance to Black American and potentially Black African or non-white people to your projects, why were you an appropriate person to write this book?
I don't know that I was an appropriate person to write this book. I've actually asked a lot of people and I've talked to a lot of people about it. I didn't know anybody else who was going to do it though. And so I tried to be conscientious and aware of the difference between me and many of the people I was talking to. I also talked to a lot of white queer Jews. So although I'm not sure any of them appear in the book besides me. I felt that my familiarity with the white foundation world as a potential audience for this was important, but I don't make any claims that I am the best or the only person to write this book. And in fact, I deliberately hope the way I did the research was in such a way that you cannot draw from this book, if you do, you're making it up, that Black women between the ages of 18 and 22 do X more than Y. You can't. I didn't do it that way. I'm not equipped to do it that way. But I hope I opened the door for a lot more of attention to storytelling from and respect for these ways of giving.
Yeah, so what is a Guana Americana from Miami doing, writing a book on a white Swede that white Anglo-American liberals love? That's my question for myself that I ask myself every other day, not every day, but every other day. Yeah, no, totally. I think I shouldn't. Yeah, I've long asked myself, like, even to be an intellectual or a scholar, I'm not supposed to be, right? Like, or who gets to write about what? I think it's an important question that I think it's Adrian Fisk, is that right? Was asking. I think it's central. For a long time, I mean, the scholarship is based on domination and authoritative scholarly conversations. Like, why do certain people have space to write about anything, specifically white Anglo-American men and those who are, close or proximate to that identity? So I think it's a really valid question and one that I definitely have in mind. To me, as a Latina woman, I think that the white-Black color line is central for all of us who are non-white, and in the sense of to understand where I fit in this country and what sort of robust definition of equality I wanted to subscribe to, or what I wanted to push back against white Anglo-American supremacy. The African-American experience was something that I still lean on, and scholars in the academy. Now, this book is about white people and the way they think about things. And the time that the scholars are coming in is when you have specifically Black male scholars who are in the periphery, but visible in this network of funders and grantees. I don't see in this, when I'm doing this research, within the periphery, even Black women, Latina women. So it's a focus on these white actors and just their ecosystem of funding, advisors, etc. But feel free, definitely judge my work for it. Give me feedback. Let me know where I fail.
This question resonates for me too. Is I'm a non-native scholar whose work overlaps and intersects with Native American history, and I think about this question all the time. And part of my answers relates back to that question of how everything has become commoditized within market relations and a sort of system of global capitalism. For me, my lodestar is Cedric Robinson, who always gives, in his book Black Marxism, starts a book about Black intellectuals in the 20th century in Europe and how Europe colonized itself and did those same sort of historical processes that came to become global after 1492. And so I think of myself as someone who is conscripted into a system of domination that I'm trying to understand, and particularly vis-a-vis philanthropic organizations and the nature of schooling. But the question is a good one, and one that I'm glad was provoked in the conversation. We have maybe 10 minutes, so I'm going to say one question for last, which is a big picture question, and go to this one. We have seen a rise of equity, diversity, and inclusion movements across the North American after BLM protests. Do you see these EDI initiatives as a useful framework to inform giving in terms of bringing in voices of groups that can create feedback loops for more effective giving? In other words,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
The language in the question is, I'm going to interpret it the way I've been trying to interpret it. If you're talking about, are DEI initiatives important to white foundations? They're a start. They're by no means an end. I'd also say that, since last year and the killing of George Floyd and the rise of the BLM, or the visibility of the Black Lives Matter, we are in the beginning of an extraordinary backlash, white backlash, intensified and intensifying. So there's history doesn't go straight, as everybody on this call knows. I think DEI is important. I think it is just literally the barest beginning of real change. And I think the way the question is structured, I don't know who asked it or what they're thinking of, but there's so much about these institutions and these systems that are about, this is the way we've built this place. We're going to invite in a few people who don't look white, or who don't look straight, or who don't look male, or who whatever, and our job is done. And that is not even, no, well, that's not enough. It's not what's needed. It's just the beginning.
So I think the question's really interesting too. Thanks, Jenny. Do you see EDI as a useful framework to inform? So the use of the word to inform, not to decide, giving to bring in voices. So you bring in the voices from the group to create feedback loops. So it's not necessarily, it's almost explicit, implicitly showing how the relationship of domination isn't shifting. It's bringing in voices to inform, to be considered in the suggestion box. So one question is, what about changing the board makeup, right? And I study boards historically, so it's not just bringing in people on the board, but also spaces for real, for shaping grant making practices. And then beyond that, really questioning, the hierarchy of economics within philanthropy. So why should the CEO make a certain amount of money versus staff and versus grantees? Who deserves a different quality of life? What are the expectations of it? And that leads to a broader, not just national, but global question about, it's assuming philanthropy is a space of love of mankind, right? Or at least solving these urgent problems and having this moral imperative to solve them. Why should one person in one part of the world be assumed to need less versus another? So even these morally layered descriptions of fair trade, right? What's really implicit in these ideas about what is fair, what is enough? And we have, as Lucy was saying, and Khalil, you were suggesting too, the deep problems, because you have a foundation, right, where a CEO sitting in San Francisco or New York is making quite a bit of money and more proximate staff. And then you have the ultimate grantees somewhere else in the world assumed to have or need less. So I think there has to be a deep reckoning of the whole ecosystem of philanthropy, both in the boardroom and the staff, and then also in its tracks globally.
Someone who studies the history of education, going back to antiquity, I am always reminded, and give or take, how much credence you will give to etymological origins, but the etymology of the word inclusion shares the same root as incarceration. And I think of that as, they're both systems of capture and containment that aren't fundamentally about changing a structure, but I think both of your answers spoke to that commonality. So we have 7 or 8 minutes left. I'm going to combine the 2 questions and answer as you will. One asks, do you ever fear that in an era of ascendant critique of philanthropy, the kind of deep obligation or duty we sometimes feel to each other that Lucy describes is being obfuscated or denigrated? The second question says, it congratulates you on speaking truth with an exclamation point. And it wants to know that given that many Black and racialized people have long known about the foundations of corporate philanthropy, where do we go from here? And can you possibly speak to Dean Spay's idea of solidarity and not charity?
You want to go first, Maribel? You want me to go?
Go ahead, Lucy.
Okay, thank you. Quickly, how quickly can I do this? The answer, I think, to the first question is is the commodification and the transactional nature sort of denigrating our commitment to each other? I absolutely. I don't think it's only within this space. I think it comes from many places, but I would say very much yes. I think the privileges bestowed upon this particular action of transferring financial capital from one person to another and creating a whole system of organizations and laws and blah, 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 that really privileges this, has narrowed our understanding of where humans fit into the planet, let alone how we relate to one another. So that's actually a question I can give you a one-word answer to. So the answer is going to be yes. The second question about where do we go from here? Can I speak more to the mutual aid solidarity? I'll say only this. I actually, because I have so much respect for the depth of what motivates real mutual aid and solidarity efforts, and this was a book about giving, I didn't want to go into them in the kind of superficial journalistic way that these phenomenon, which have been with us for a long time, have been treated in the press over the last year. So I don't do this in the book, but I will say this. The chapter in the book that left me the most confused is the chapter on data. And people have asked me since the book has been published, shouldn't we be coming up, what do we do next about giving data? And I think we have an opportunity to follow Black women, to follow people with disabilities, to let people of color and immigrants and transgendered individuals and women in general, all of the people who have been extracted from and taken from and hurt for generations in general, but specifically through the digital economy as it's grown in this country and globally, we should follow their lead on if this is a good thing to do, leaving open the possibility of refusing this. And then if some types of giving data are in fact seen to could be constructed in a way that's more beneficial than harmful, to use that wisdom and that imagination to figure out how to do it. And almost any other path I could imagine to get there leads to a a recreation of the domination of foundations as philanthropy or worse. And I can imagine the worst much more easily. So what's exciting to me is the opportunity to give digital data gives us a chance to reimagine the whole of what we call philanthropy in the United States in the 21st century. And that is a huge opportunity. And I would those who've been doing stuff this whole time and have looked skeptically upon this endeavor this whole time to lead us to that.
Thanks, Lucy. So as far as criticism, I think many, I'll answer the first one and then the next one by Caroline. It's not unique for communities to fear criticism. You know, even in the US, right? People criticize just anti-Black discrimination, the very existence of it. And some people might say, you either like it here or you leave, right? That's not so uncommon in communities, right? Like you either like our practices or you leave. To me, and I think it could resonate with other critical scholars of philanthropy, and I'll just speak for myself, it comes from a place of love. If I didn't care this much, I wouldn't criticize. I'm a critical Cuban because I love my community. I'm a critical Catholic because I believe in its social justice mission. I'm a critical American because we here, like other countries, can do so much better. And all of it coming from a place of humility, like a love and humility. And what does it mean to be a good human being? And if we're actually honest about that, what does it mean to be a good human being is a really, really tough question and a lifelong journey of critical self-analysis of ourselves, our micro intentions, as Lucy mentions and discusses in her book, like how we're giving in our everyday lives, to how we do our work, to even the ideas we have about each other. And my work focuses on ideas. I care about ideas. I do think ideas have a lot of power. We know they have power. We see its power now when critical race theory is mentioned with some quick steps, and it gets people riled up. So ideas have power, and we need to understand where these ideas come from and what their intentions are. And white philanthropy is a study in understanding where ideas come from and what their intentions are. And with that knowledge, trying to think through better ideas that bring us together. So the critique is about bringing us and gluing us back together in a stronger form. And as far as solidarity economies and where we go from here, I would say that, Caroline, we've had these conversations before. Clearly, we're in the project of the Miami Institute together. And I'm very invested. We are all, many of us across the world, very invested in understanding for whom do we write scholarship? For whom are we producing data collection? First of all, for whom are we shaping research questions? What is the problem? Through whose eyes? So for whom are we creating research questions? For whom are we collecting data on our groups of population, for example, or others? And for whom are we producing that analysis? So one thing that we are doing and trying to do at the Miami Institute, which is going against the grain, is to create a mutual aid model of support for knowledge production, centering the global majority as our major group to be accountable to, instead of just specifically funders, again, in the global north and specifically in the US. So those are my two quick questions, answers, I mean.
Before Rob jumps in to conclude us, I would like to say that Maribel's book concludes with a call for scholars to not only consider Gunnar Myrdal's book, The American Dilemma, but to really sit with the Black scholars who critiqued that work and whose voices were overshadowed. And in that sense, I would like to second the ethos of Lucy's work, which is that we need to move beyond the received categories, the sanctioned ways of thinking about giving and about philanthropy and about public policy and about democratic participation, And because those ways are bound up with a global formation that, to echo the title of Maribel's book, was always justified as philanthropy through colonialism. Slavery was justified as benevolence. Colonization was justified as benevolence. And they were funded as philanthropic endeavors of a global civilizing order, of which we are now the inheritors. And so just to note that these two works are, in my sense, like immensely important. I hope you will go out and buy them or borrow them from your lending library or steal them from Amazon. And I thank you for your time. I'll turn things over to Rob.
Thank you so much, Khalil, Maribel, and Lucy. I just want to close us out by offering a quick reflection on the conversation and on the very idea of power at the center of the conversation. One conventional way to think about power, whether it's within philanthropy, within politics, within the family, in any space, is the ability of one person to get someone else to do something. And forms of power in that respect are ubiquitous, and we can analyze them almost anywhere they take place. But there are multiple levels or layers in which power is wielded. And it goes beyond the ability to get people to do things that a philanthropist might do by making a donation, which gets someone to do something that's in tune with what the philanthropist would like to see done. One other significant kind of power is agenda setting power, not getting somebody to do something, but setting the option set for other people in which they then make some choices. And then further, power also is contained within ideology itself, the ways in which philanthropic power, as Khalil just summarized, has been part of a governing ideology that often goes unquestioned because it's the air we breathe, the water we swim in, and the ways in which philanthropic power has not only been a mechanism in the past and in the present to get people to do things, but to provide the very options of their existence and then the governing ideology in which we all live. Those are the even greater forms of power. And the two books we've been discussing today from Lucy and Maribel help to excavate and expose, allow us to interrogate and analyze these multiple forms of power within philanthropy, and to imagine and reimagine the ways in which it might be exercised, not on behalf of the governing ideology, not on behalf of an option set that belongs to the mindset of the donor, but on behalf of a more liberatory agenda that we might think is ever more necessary today, given the reinscription of power that we see within the broader political economy in the United States and elsewhere. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today and for this discussion. I do also greatly recommend that you go off and borrow the books that we've been discussing, and I look forward to future conversations. Thank you once again for joining us. Thanks to Khalil, Maribel, and Lucy, and we hope to see you again sometime soon.